In rural Texas, 5 young people encounter a murderous family of cannibals. Join us as we chat about Alan's internal monologue during an Ironman, plaster of Paris animal bones, and the danger of picking up hitchhikers. Then we find out if 1974's The Texas Chain Saw Massacre stands the test of time.
Test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today? James says gladiator with a glutton. Alan says as a father, blah blah. It's the test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today? Test of time, James and Alan have their say. Do the movies you love still hold up today?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Test of Time and episode 2 of our Spooktober October Scary Movie Fest. Today, we're going to be talking about 1974's The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. But before we do that, I want to introduce my podcast partner and the director of this show, Alan Noah. How are you doing, Al?
I am doing okay, thank you. How you doing, James?
I'm very good. It's Spooktober. It's a fun time of year. I like going out running and being more active, but you actually did something recently that I'm incredibly impressed by. Why don't you tell the listeners what you just recently did?
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I just completed my first ever Ironman. It was here in New York. It was at Jones Beach. It was fucking hard.
Why don't you tell people what Ironman is? In case they're only familiar with the, Robert Downey Jr. version.
Sure. So Ironman, it's a brand. It's a company name, but it is a type of triathlon. And I did the Ironman 70.3, which means it was a 1.2 mile swim, a 56 mile bike ride, and then a 13.1 mile run.
AKA half a marathon.
Correct. Yes. All in a row, all in one day. The weather was awful. Just absolutely terrible. It was rainy. It was windy. The swim was in a bay, so not the ocean, where it would, in theory, be calmer. But it was really, really choppy. The first half, it was just literally just trying to keep my head above water. I felt like I wasn't really swimming. I was just kind of moving and trying to stay alive. And then once I got to the halfway point and turned around, then the current was at my back and it was a little bit better, but the wind made the bike ride pretty tough. And God, the run, half of the run, the wind was just in my face, pushing me backwards. And it just kept getting worse. And it was really, really kind of terrible.
The fact that you do these 3 sports, it sounds like, oh, well, they're all just, athletics. No, swimming is completely different than marathoning. And just because you train for a marathon does not mean that you can bike 20 miles. Or how long was the bike?
56.
56 miles. Oh, my God. How did you train for biking?
I just biked a lot. I followed a training plan that was pretty specific in terms of what to do with the swimming and the biking and the running. And ordinarily, I like to mix up workouts and do different kinds of things. Really, for the past 6 months, basically all I was doing was swimming, biking, and running, or some combination thereof. And yeah, you extend the distance. You start off at 5 miles, 10 miles, 15 miles. You just build up to it.
I guess you can't use a stationary bike to train for this.
No, you can. I did plenty of Peloton rides, for sure. I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages. I think that you can't only do indoor Peloton rides as training, just like you can't only do treadmill runs or only swim in a pool. Like if you're training for a race, you do have to swim in open water. You have to bike outside, you have to run outside, but certainly doing some of the indoor workouts to supplement. I mean, hell yeah, there's some days it's just easier. It's just easier in terms of timing and logistics, or if the weather's bad, for sure you can do stuff inside. Definitely.
So, when you're down and out and, the pain is getting to you and you got that lactic acid build up, what gets you to go? Is it me, Al? Do you think I got to do it for James? Because I've got to tell him and the listeners, and I've got to tell them all. I've got to do it for them.
No offense. Although part of my internal monologue was talking to you and having podcast conversations in my brain, in part because you're not allowed to listen to music during Ironman. You have to, like, no headphones, instant disqualification if they catch you with headphones.
Wow.
It's for safety, and that makes sense. But yeah, it is just me and my thoughts, which, isn't great. And yeah, I wanted to quit for pretty much the entire thing.
From the starting gun.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it was a rolling start to the swim. I'm just standing there in the rain and I'm like, this is awful. This is miserable. Then I'm like, I just want to get in the water because then I'll be moving and that'll feel better. Even if the water's cold, whatever. And then I get into the water and the waves are just smacking me in the face. I'm like, no, this is not better. I should quit. Yeah, I wanted to quit the whole entire time. What kept me going? I just felt like I worked too damn hard to give up. And that if I just felt like I had to keep going, and that if I didn't finish this, it would be just such a letdown. Sure, for Courtney and the kids, but really for me. Honestly, I didn't want to let myself down.
How many people quit? I mean, there must be people that don't complete it.
I don't know the answer. I did see, like, on a Facebook post that there were a lot of people talking about that exact thing, and apparently a lot of people did quit because the swim was so bad, the bike was so painful, the run was so windy. Yeah, it was so rainy, it was so windy. Apparently a lot of people didn't finish. I was close to the cutoff, and there were a couple cutoffs along the way. You have to start the second bike lap by 11:30. I started it at 11:13. So I had 17 fucking minutes. Not a lot of pad there, but that also just kind of motivated me to, like, okay, well, now I have to keep going. I can't quit when I'm, like, just barely ahead. So I just really, really wanted to finish. I just wanted to get that medal and that picture of me crossing the finish line. And then after I did, all I wanted to do was just curl up in a ball and die.
Very nice. You checked off marathon, Ironman. Is there anything left? Are you going to do one of those mud things, like the Tough Mudder?
I've done Spartan races, which are kind of like Tough Mudders. The Tough Mudders sound worse to me, though, because some of those things, it's like, they're not feats of strength. There's a thing that you have to run through with live wires, and you can be electrocuted. That doesn't prove that you're tough. That just can kill you. Like, I don't really see the point of that.
Also, when you're done with Tough Mudder, it's a very different photo than when you're done with any other race. You've got that iconic, you're covered in mud, and it just looks kind of cool.
It does. My finish line photos from the Spartan races are that, covered in mud, covered in dirt and grime, and those are fun. Honestly, I think I'm going to maybe take a little break from racing for a bit. I have a 5K at the end of October I'm going to do, but I think I just need to not do that for a little while. It's a thing with triathletes in particular where they finish a race and they say, I'm never doing one of these again. And then 2 days later, they sign up for another one. So that very well might happen, but not right now. I think I just need a little break. But let's get into the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. This is a movie that I thought would be perfect for us to talk about during our Spooktober scary movie season. One, because I'd never seen it. Two, because I saw that it was celebrating its 50th anniversary. And then I was like, okay, that's all the excuse I need. Had you ever seen this movie before, James?
I'm 90% sure I had, and okay. I'm even more positive I had seen the remake, the one in the early 2000s. I think it's been remade again. It was remade again in 2022, and then they made a bunch of sequels and prequels.
Yes.
But I did see this film once.
Gotcha. Well, why don't you tell our listeners what the movie's all about?
This is a slasher film. The movie begins with news stories about graves being robbed and desecrated. And our story finds 5 young people driving through Texas when they decide to check on a family plot to see if the remains of a relative were disturbed. They weren't, but the group then decides to pick up a creepy hitchhiker. After the hitchhiker slashes Franklin, a member of their group in a wheelchair, the teens kick the hitchhiker out of their van. But despite the warnings of a man who owns a local gas station, the teens then explore a house that appears to be abandoned, and one by one, they are murdered by a masked figure wielding a chainsaw. Sally, the only survivor, is then kidnapped by the gas station proprietor, who turns out to be the father of the creepy hitchhiker and the masked killer Leatherface. Sally is brought back to their home and is tortured before managing to escape. The hitchhiker is killed, and Leatherface dances in the sun with his chainsaw as the movie comes to an end.
Right. And I don't need to ask you if this movie was a hit, because clearly it was, because there have been 9 movies in this franchise over the half century since this first came out.
This is probably one of the original low-budget horror films, and I've seen different reports of how much this movie cost to make, anywhere from $80,000 to $140,000, and this film grossed over $30 million at the 1970s and through re-releases American box office, and they sold over 16.5 million tickets in 1974.
Wow.
It was a huge success. It's one of these things that the concept is so simple. And also, I don't think audiences had ever seen anything like this before. Something else that I'm sure led to the box office take, similar to the way the box office take was definitely increased for Blair Witch, was the opening crawl.
Right.
I think it's genius, the opening crawl. What does the opening crawl kind of lead the viewer to believe?
It's basically saying that this was based on a true story.
Absolutely.
It very, very, very strongly implies that that is the case when it was not. And there are people who, to this day, think that it is, and that's a lie. And other movies have done this too. Blair Witch Project, which
Right.
you mentioned, that was kind of positioned as this really happened. This is actual found footage. Fargo says that it's based on a true story.
I think that's the perfect word that you're saying. It was positioned that way. I'm guessing there's somewhere in the credits that says the movie is a work of fiction, or did they not do that back then?
I was looking for that at the end, and I didn't see it. It's definitely possible that it was there, and I missed it. But 2 other things that are notable about the opening text on screen and voiceover. Did you recognize the guy who was reading that voiceover?
No.
I didn't at first, but it's John Larroquette,
Wow.
probably most famous for Night Court. Yeah, who claims that he was paid for his work with a joint. 1 joint, it was his payment, so he says. But the other thing that really annoys me about this opening with the text on screen, they spell chainsaw wrong. They write it as 2 words.
You're right. I'm sure that's an alternate way of spelling it.
Nope.
It really
Incorrect.
isn't. It's completely a typo.
It's just an incorrect way of spelling it.
Oh, wow.
It's wrong. And it's wrong on the official movie poster, in the National Film Registry database, whatever it's called. It is spelled wrong. Chain space saw, 2 words. When I post this episode, I am going to spell it wrong, for our episode title, because I match, how the movies were released. But it pisses me off. It just kind of pisses me off that it's wrong. And in all the subsequent remakes and sequels and prequels and everything, chainsaw is 1 word. They corrected it, but in this movie, it is spelled wrong. But I was really struck as I was watching the movie about how slow it starts. You don't see Leatherface until 35 minutes in. It's 5 minutes after that until you see him with the chainsaw.
Yep.
And so much of the beginning of this movie is just setting the scene and creating mood. And the mood that it creates is fear. And you get that right away. You get that from the news reports of the graves being robbed. You get that from the shots of the cemetery where these bones are there. You clearly understand that this is a dangerous world. Fucked up shit is happening. Then they start talking about all of their astrology stuff and how Saturn is in retrograde. And that just means bad things are going to happen. And, you're watching a movie called The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. Even without that opening narration, bad things are going to happen. Some of these people are going to get killed by a chainsaw. But it really takes its time building up the mood. How did you feel about that? Were you bored? Were you into it?
I absolutely looked at the clock. It's a different way of filmmaking because, as I mentioned before, yes, I had seen the 2003-ish Jessica Biel remake, and while I don't remember the structure of that film, I remember watching this film and going, I don't think this is how they would have made a film in a more modern setting, and I even think I count 2003 as modern. I would be surprised if you don't see Leatherface for 35 minutes in that film. It just felt very 1970s, like slow introduction. That's just how they did things.
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking about a movie we talked about recently, Rear Window, where I was kind of grumbling about how the mystery in that movie was very straightforward. And a couple people commented to me, notably friend of the show, Eddie Perez Cortez. He mentioned like, yeah, but it's not all about the mystery. It's about the mood. And he's right. That's definitely a fair point. Maybe I was just kind of more attuned to it watching this movie, but it really is about setting up the mood. It does still feel different. I think to your point, it does feel different from a modern horror movie where it is just so slow and deliberate in what it is building up. And there are some twists in there. When they pick up that hitchhiker, clearly he is unwell, and there's a ton of foreshadowing there where he's talking about how they used to do the slaughterhouse with the hammer, but now they use the air gun, and the hammer was better, and that was a better kill, and now they're out of work because they were replaced by the air gun. This is all setting up what's going to come later. But when he is finally pushed out of the van and he like rubs blood on the van, I thought that he was marking the van. Franklin, the brother in the wheelchair, he says he marked the van. I thought that was going to come back into play. Like later, Leatherface was going to be looking for a van with the blood smear. Okay, we kill these guys. That doesn't happen. That doesn't really go anywhere.
You're absolutely right. It doesn't lead anywhere that like you would think. You know, we grew up in the 80s and 90s, and hitchhiking was basically, you pick up a hitchhiker, you have about a 75% chance of being murdered, is essentially what, my parents and pop culture taught me.
Yeah.
When they were thinking of picking up this person, the fact that they did was so wild to me, but it's a 70s thing.
When we just talked about Outside Providence, there's a ton of hitchhiking in that movie, and it's fine. It's just how, like, the characters get back and forth around New England. And I could believe that there were far more incidences in the 70s of people picking up hitchhikers where it was just totally boring and nothing notable happened. But yeah, I mean, I remember when I drove cross country with my friend Aaron Newman, before we went, I got a lot of speeches from my mom, but one of them was never pick up a hitchhiker. I was like, why would I? Why on earth would I do that? And apparently this movie contributed to there being fewer hitchhikers. Some Texas sheriff or something, he said something like that, like, thank you to the movie for discouraging people from doing that, because apparently it fell after this movie. Understandably so. Well, let's talk a little bit about Leatherface. And when you first see him in the movie, a thing that really kind of surprised me is that the first 3 victims of Leatherface, they all go into his house. Leatherface is not looking to kill people. And when the teens first go to that gas station and they're like, oh, we're going to check out this old house, it's part of our old family's property or something, the guy at the gas station says, don't do that. That's a bad idea. If you go into someone's house and there's someone's there, they might not like it. We later find out that he's Leatherface's dad. And, if they're true psychopaths, then he might say, yeah, you should go up there. We wanted to kill you. They don't want to kill people. They're cannibals. They like eating people, but they're grave robbers. They really don't want to go out of their way to kill people. And the reason that the first 3 people are killed is because they just walk into this house. It's not breaking and entering, the door's open, but in the same way that you shouldn't pick up a hitchhiker, you also shouldn't go into somebody's house and start screaming, hey, 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 anybody home? You ring the doorbell, you knock. If no one answers, you leave. And I'm not saying they deserve to be murdered in the horrible, brutal fashion that they are, but I couldn't help but think of these stand your ground laws. I could see a lawyer, either today or then, saying these murders were justified, especially considering that Leatherface is seemingly mentally disturbed, mentally challenged.
I'm glad you brought that up because this film, of course, takes place in Texas. And Texas Penal Code, Chapter 9, Subchapter D, the quote-unquote protection of property clauses, which are sometimes known as the Castle Doctrine laws. I think a lawyer could probably pick this up. You know, this is America. Anyone can be armed. So if you walk into a house in Texas today, maybe you're going to get shot. And really, there is no difference between a mallet, a chainsaw, and a gun. This Texas Penal Code says you can use deadly force. It turns out that he's not justified because he goes out and kills the fourth person, the guy in the wheelchair, and he attempts to kill Sally, and they abduct her at the gas station. So those last two are not Castle Doctrine.
Although, are they on their property? When Leatherface kills Franklin, you don't know.
I did look it up. Can you kill someone for being on your property in Texas? And that's actually a no.
Okay. There have been stories over the past year or so where people are like lost and they pull into someone's driveway and they're just going to make a 3-point turn and they get shot. Or a parent thinks that their kid is over at this house playing with a friend and it's actually the house 2 doors down. They pick the wrong house and then, you know, the homeowner shoots them. And these things are tragic and they're awful and it's horrible, but I couldn't help think of these things while watching this scene because also that's sort of just not how you think it's going to go in a horror movie. In a slasher movie, Michael Myers is going after these kids no matter what. Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, like they go after people because that's what they do. They're psychos, they're killers. And this guy is just like, hey, why are there all these people? Why are they keep coming into my house? Also, this movie is called The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. He only kills one person with the chainsaw, Franklin. You know, he just kind of like shoves the chainsaw into him. He appears to dismember one victim with the chainsaw. You don't see it. And, you know, I guess you could still call it a chainsaw massacre if he's cutting people up with the chainsaw, even if he uses the hammer to kill him. But the movie is not gory at all. There is very, very little blood. Part of that was just due to budget. You know, this movie was made on a shoestring budget and they didn't have money for special effects. A lot of the bones and entrails and things are real. I guess that's cheaper, to use real animal carcasses than making bones out of plaster of Paris or whatever. I was surprised at the lack of gore.
So Tobe Hooper, the director, he wanted the MPAA to give the original uncut cut of this film. He wanted it to get a PG rating. Now, remember, this is a 1974 PG. We've talked about this a lot in the past. There didn't used to be PG-13, not until like the mid-'80s. I think Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom or Gremlins, around that time it came out. But they actually got an X. And the reason that Toby thought it was going to get a PG was specifically what you just said. There really is minimal gore. Yeah, I mean, the guy cuts his foot at the end, a little bit of chainsaw at the end, but really there's very little. After several minutes were cut, it was resubmitted and received an R rating.
So that is disputed. I've read those stories too. There are other stories that, no, Tobe Hooper never wanted the movie to be rated PG. He wanted to make a scary movie, and having it rated PG would make people think it was a kid's movie. So he always wanted it to be R. That was always what he was going for. He didn't want the X rating, and so he did have to make some edits along the way. And, look, I don't know which story is true. To me, it seems more likely that he was never going for a PG, because that just feels like, come on, man. You're making a movie called The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, and you think it's going to get a PG rating? Come on. But it is possible, given some of the other stories about Tobe Hooper, who apparently wasn't great on set. He made everyone work really, really long shoot days in extreme heat. They were not given proper breaks. They were not given opportunities to take off the costumes, particularly Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface. He wasn't allowed to change out of the masks and the clothes and the aprons and everything. When Marilyn Burns, who played Sally, is cut at the end, and then Grandpa sucks on her finger, They were going to use fake blood, like a prosthetic or whatever. It just wasn't working. And so then eventually they were like, screw it, just cut her finger. Let her bleed for real, which is really shitty and super unethical and a horrible thing to do.
Well, unless you're getting like hazard pay and you know about it.
Right. And the actress was not consulted or informed. They just cut her for real.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Apparently, everyone on this movie hated Tobe Hooper. They all kind of hated each other, probably because they were shooting 20-hour days in 100-degree heat without air conditioning. Regardless of the rating he was going for, Tobe Hooper does not have a great reputation, at least in terms of this movie. I know he also directed the first Poltergeist movie. I wasn't really familiar with a lot of the other stuff on his IMDb page, but I guess he made a couple of really influential horror movies, so good for him, I guess. Here's another random thing that I was expecting to happen in this movie that 100% didn't. Jump scares. There are no jump scares in this movie. Did you notice that?
No, I didn't notice that, but you're absolutely right. There's no fake scares.
Yeah, when you first see Leatherface and he kills the guy with the sledgehammer, it's brutal and shocking, and I think that's very much what they were going for. But yeah, there's not like that music sting with the screeching violins. There's just none of that. There are fast edits, and Tobe Hooper was like slicing frames off of certain shots to make the edits feel more drastic, but there's just a lot of like extreme close-ups, like especially at that dinner scene at the end where Sally is just kind of bound and tied to the chair, and you just see like really, really extreme close-ups of her eyeball, and it works. It's effective at making you tense and scared, but just in terms of the cinematography, the way it was shot, the way it was edited, definitely feels different from a modern horror movie.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are different in this horror movie. Another thing I thought was very different was the way they treated the character Franklin. That's the character in a wheelchair. They don't really pay too much attention to the fact that he's in a wheelchair. I actually thought that they were going to go somewhere with it, and I was kind of glad that he's just one of the supporting characters. He's with Sally, and that he's just kind of killed like any of the other characters. They just jump out and kill him. If he was in a wheelchair or not, he would have probably been killed the same way.
Along those lines, I wanted to ask you, as a doctor, in the opening VO, they refer to him as an invalid. Is that a word that people still use about people who are paralyzed or in wheelchairs? I feel like I haven't heard that in a long time. It sounds insulting and offensive, but I wanted to ask you about that.
It's an old term. That's not a proper word that people use today.
Okay.
One of the most famous hospitals in the United States and the world is a place called Johns Hopkins, and
Sure.
the pediatrics place at Johns Hopkins is Harriet Lane. The full name is Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children. Scientifically, it means one thing, but you just don't say it.
You know, it also did occur to me that Franklin is sort of a parallel to Leatherface. Obviously, they're very, very different, but they are both these sort of black sheeps of the family. Sally brings her brother Franklin along on this road trip. He knows that they don't really want him there. He's the fifth wheel. There's two couples and Franklin. There's that moment when they get to that first house that is just abandoned and no one kills them there, but they all run upstairs and they're all laughing and giggling upstairs, and he hears them downstairs. He can't join them. He's frustrated, clearly, understandably. He's like blowing, I think you call it blowing raspberries, when he's like over and over again. He's pissed off. And yeah, he's gentle, but also that does kind of mirror Leatherface, where he is confined to the house. He's not welcome in public, in part because he wears people's faces, and, you know, that's creepy. But when the gas station owner gets back to the house, he's like, "What did your brother do? If he got out, you're in trouble," like saying to the hitchhiker. As weird as that family is, he is the weirdo in that family. He is the black sheep. I don't really know if there was more of a point to that, you know, that those two characters shared some commonality, but just something I noticed.
Well, it's something I actually liked about this film in that they don't give us something that a modern film would give us, and that they don't give us an explanation. What the hell is going on here? We don't know why they're doing this. We don't know why there are meat hooks everywhere. We don't know where this face came from, this leather face. We get none of this. Whereas in a modern film, I feel like we would stumble upon some kind of clue as to, oh, this guy escaped from a mental asylum or something like that. Or we would get some explanation. This movie is easily the middle chapter of something. One of the 9 movies in the franchise is a prequel, and it totally makes sense that there should be a prequel. And the movie also easily leads itself to a sequel, and there are several sequels. So, but I don't think the film needed an explanation or even a complete conclusion. You didn't need to kill the guy at the end. And I feel like that was just genuinely a choice. Like, it doesn't have to be that, kill scene with the great pun before you stab the guy. She escapes and Leatherface just chainsaws into the wind in the end.
I a little bit disagree that there's no explanation. I think we do get some explanation here. This is a poor family. They lost their job at the slaughterhouse. We get that from the hitchhiker. And so they are cannibals. They are eating people. It's not explicitly stated, but it seems like this is how they survive. They don't enjoy killing, or at least the gas station owner, the dad, doesn't. He says, I've got no love for killing. They've been robbing graves to find food. They're eating the food. They're cooking it up. When strangers come over and are like, hey, should we go to that house? They're like, no, please don't. When the teenagers go into the house anyway, well, then they kind of, with air quotes, have to kill them because now they're witnesses. And so it does seem like their motivations are born out of desperation.
Don't they run a gas station?
And there's no gas. And I'm not saying it's justified. It's not.
I guess. I mean, most people starving don't go to that. I mean, I'm saying what it doesn't explain why they're complete psychopaths. This isn't a group of soccer players strapped in the Andes and they have to eat food to survive. I just don't feel like it explains why they go insane and be cannibals.
It's not a good explanation. I'm not saying this actually justifies it. Also, the movie starts off with all of the those news reports about the grave robbers and all of that, which is important for the plot. But also, as the opening goes on, you hear so much in these news reports about famine and floods and murders and terrible, terrible things that are happening. And it's very much creating a sense of a world on the brink and people who are pushed to desperation. And I think that there is something also that does stand the test of time in terms of violence without a meaning. I don't remember when the movie came out, but there was that horror movie called The Strangers, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago or so. And I think there's a new one coming out, a prequel, a reboot or something, where these people are killed because. It's just because. They say that explicitly in the movie. Why? Why are you doing this to us? I don't know, you're here. And so I think that there is something about the randomness in the movie that does still happen in some horror movies. What I think doesn't stand the test of time more is the lack of a theme, with a capital T, a point. And a lot of horror movies do have that. Even Night of the Living Dead, which came out in the late 60s, that was kind of about urbanization and racism and gentrification and things like that. Even though I realize I just said 2 seconds ago that this movie takes place in a bleak world, and maybe that's kind of what the point is, the theme is about poor people driven to the brink and desperation and all that. I feel like it's a pretty weak theme. I recently watched with my daughter Smile, that horror movie from last year or a couple years ago. The woman on the poster has like the big evil smile. I don't know if you saw it. If you haven't, don't. It's fucking disturbing as all hell. But there are themes. There's a point. The movie is trying to say something about mental health, and it does it in the creepiest, freakiest, nightmare-inducingest way possible. I feel like Texas Chain Saw Massacre really doesn't land a point. It just does feel more random, which was probably the point, but it does kind of also make it feel dated in a way.
I mean, there are things that that they're definitely dated. Like the ending of this film, the remake, the 2003 remake, she also escapes in a car, and 2 days later, a couple officers investigating the house, they're killed by Leatherface, and the case remains open. And that's a much more modern way of ending the film.
Right.
Well, I guess there's only one more thing to do in a podcast called The Test of Time, and that is to find out, Alan, does the 1974 version of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, the original, does it stand the test of time?
I don't think so. I appreciate what this movie created in terms of the franchise that it inspired. Apparently, there's a 10th movie in development right now. They'll probably just keep making these forever. I think this movie is scary, and I think it evokes true horror, but it does feel incomplete. It feels like there's something missing here. Maybe that's a bigger point, a bigger theme. I don't really care for gore, so I'm fine that the movie doesn't have much. Maybe that does make it feel like a little empty. I don't know. I don't really want to criticize the movie for that, but it feels like a movie that was made by a guy who was like, hey, you know what would be cool? If a guy with a chainsaw was killing people. Let's make that. And it's just kind of random, pointless violence that is, to me, sound and fury signifying nothing. And also, I'm not a big horror movie fan. I'm not a big slasher fan. So I can appreciate this movie for what it is, but I don't really think that it stands the test of time. Actually, the one thing that I will say maybe does stand the test of time is that I see these articles all the time. I don't know if you see them too, about how if you want to help the environment, you know what the best thing you can do is be a vegetarian. I feel like there's like a push for like vegetarianism that just exists in the world. Also, my daughter's a vegetarian, so maybe I'm just kind of more tuned into it. But this movie really does advocate for vegetarianism. That is a strong theme about what happens to animals. The victims in this movie are slaughtered like animals in a slaughterhouse that is very deliberate. They talk about the slaughterhouse. Apparently, this movie inspired Guillermo del Toro to be a vegetarian for many, many years. And I would imagine that's true with many other people who watch this movie and were like, you know what? I'm not going to have a burger today or maybe ever again. And I certainly can appreciate that. But I don't think it's a terrible movie. I think they did a lot on a shoestring budget. Tobe Hooper did a lot of that unethically, but I'm going to say no, that it doesn't stand the test of time. What do you think, James?
This is a podcast called The Test of Time. That's the question we have today, not whether this film is something that you should watch in a film class, which absolutely you should watch this in a film class. But it's almost like you take the title first, and this title is so good. The title of this film just sells the movie. The Texas Chain Saw Massacre. You know, you said it before, and you're correct, that maybe a massacre isn't proper, or definitely not from what the viewer's going to see. Probably the police at the end, if they were to investigate the house, I'm sure there's probably a massacre there. But I understand why this film was a huge hit. No one had ever seen anything like this before. But for me, it really is more of a film appreciation. I appreciate that this exists, but I'm probably not going to watch it again. It's a cool premise, and I think if there's gonna be a film that deserves so many sequels, I'm not sure Friday the 13th, and it's like they kind of did the same thing over and over, but this film absolutely deserved both the sequel and the prequel treatment. And, you know, remakes make sense. So the premise of it stands up. But this particular film, I think it's really more the first 35 minutes. I feel like if the film had maybe just a couple more scares in the beginning between the hitchhiker and when we first see Leatherface hitting the mallet over the first guy's head, I found myself bored for a little while. And I think that's kind of a deadly sin. It's like in radio, the worst possible sin you could have is dead air. It was just dead air for a while. So for me, this film does not stand the test of time.
All right, so we are 2 for 2 that the Texas Chain Saw Massacre 1974 does not stand the test of time. That's going to do it for us this week. Next week, we're going to be watching another scary movie called The Cell. This is one that you put on the list, James. I don't know anything about this.
I don't know anything about it either, except apparently it has fans.
Okay, Jennifer Lopez is in it, right?
Yes, I believe she is.
Okay, that's all I know about it. I assume she's playing the role of a mitochondria.
Why? What would the mitochondria have something to do with the cell?
Because the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and she's a powerhouse of an actress.
Right.
It makes sense. It tracks. I'm just going to go ahead and assume she's playing a mitochondria. We'll find out next week, as will you listeners. Tune into that episode. Write to us. We are at Test of Time Pod on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Threads. Let us know your thoughts about the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, about how chainsaw is spelled, about hitchhiking, about stand your ground laws, all of these things. We love hearing from you, and we'll see you next time, everyone.
Bye.